Hello and welcome to this lesson on monitoring. We start with monitoring in this course because it impacts everything from management, performance, security and alerting. Therefore, monitoring and logging in Azure is a key feature of the platform. In fact, monitoring is so important it's enabled by default. However, this doesn't mean that we don't need to consider monitoring in our designs. Each service has its own nuances, and the platform as a whole has a number of options for how we can configure our solutions depending on our organisational needs. Monitoring is largely split into two different types, metrics and logs. Metrics describe an aspect of a system at a particular point in time and is displayed as numerical values. Logs, on the other hand, contain data that is organised into records with different sets of properties for each type. Data such as events, traces and performance data are stored as logs. Metrics and logs can also come from many different sources, and these are again generally broken down into Azure resources. So all Azure native resources produce their own metrics and logs, and as each resource is different, the types of logs you can receive from each is also different. Azure subscriptions. Events on the Azure management plane for an individual subscription is also logged. So for example, this can include information about health, deployment, interactions and modification of Azure services. Then we have the Azure tenant. So all user operations such as the creation, modification, deletion of users come from here. We can also capture application logs. So data is gathered from a custom built-in application such as a .NET application. And applications themselves often have to be discretely configured to emit their logs and information, usually to an application insights instance if we're going for Azure native logging. Operating systems also emit their own separate logs. So Windows and Linux operating systems have their own logging mechanisms within the OS, and therefore we have to install special diagnostics extensions or agents that can grab those logs and emit them out into Azure. Finally, we can create our own custom sources. So some external services or software that might get installed on a virtual machine may produce their own logs. So for example, an application might output data to a CSV file on the disk of that VM. This data can be mapped, collected, and again reported into Azure monitoring. Logs can be used and analysed to visualise the health and performance of your resource and respond to events such as, for example, CPU and RAM thresholds being met. And these in turn can be used to scale services, for example. You can also gain insights from application logs that in turn can help you fine-tune and fix problems. And you can also integrate logs and metrics from other services such as Logic apps to perform specific situations. There are a number of tools available that help us do all this monitoring, alerting and analysing of our data and logs. Some require additional steps to be configured, and we'll see that when we configure activity logs, we can also make them output to a log analytics workspace as well. However, by default, basic logs and metrics can be visualised within the Azure portal via the metrics and activity blades, and we'll see this later on. Now, having Log Analytics Workspace provides some additional benefits. First, logs can be retained for longer than 90 days, which is the default you can normally store logs for within Azure. Second, we can more easily filter and query on those logs using a language called QStore. And because data can be coming from multiple different sources, we can also combine and aggregate these queries to provide even greater insights and correlations between the data that we receive. And then finally, we can take this data and we can view it in a variety of ways, including charts, which further helps investigations and spot trends. So when designing solutions with things like log analytics, we have to consider where data is coming from and who needs to view the data. There are lots of options available. For example, you might have lots of subscriptions and a central team that monitors, and so you might want to forward all the events from all those different subscriptions to a single central space. Conversely, we might want to do the opposite. We might have one workspace per subscription or per team. It's very flexible, but always consider who's responsible for paying the charges. And this is because The charges are actually based on where you're sending the logs to, and you're charged based on transferal of data if you are going out of regions, or for the actual data that we're storing itself, as in the amount of data that we're storing. When we're dealing with native logs, for example any Azure service, the logs can be configured through the Azure portal or using ARM templates. However, we've already said with virtual machines they're a bit different because we're actually capturing OS logs and these require a separate agent. Now, because these virtual machines are generating them as part of the operating system, Windows event logs for Windows servers and syslog for Linux servers, we have to install these agents before we can start collecting the data. And at the moment, there are actually 4 different agents that can be installed on VMs, and each collect data and logs in a slightly different way and send them to different destinations. By default, only Azure activity logs and platform metrics are actually enabled. And sending those logs to a log analytics workspace or by enabling VM agents, we have to set these things explicitly. VM agents, when we install them, can also activate other tooling such as VM Insights or guest level monitoring. Finally, before we move into some actual demonstrations, be aware of another important aspect, which is the ability to generate alerts from these events that we receive. So alerts in Azure allow us to specify criteria and to automatically inform us when those criteria get hit. For each type of resource, such as a storage account, a VM, or whatever it might be, alerts start with what's called a signal, which is a piece of information, a metric, or a specific activity log. And these bits of information can come from the log analytics, they come from the activity logs, application insights, or again the performance metrics. Once we've got our signal, we can then define a criteria or condition that will trigger a rule. So for example, we can say when a certain CPU utilization occurs on a VM to trigger that rule, and that becomes our criteria. Once we've got our criteria set, we have to define what action to take. So actions are grouped as action groups, and an action group allows us to define what will actually happen when that criteria is met. So for example, we might configure it to send an email, an SMS, a push notification, or even a voice message. And then finally, we can also tell it where to send it to. So for example, an administrator's phone or email account. We can also define multiple action groups, and each with their own set of recipients and notifications, and then assign multiple action groups to any one alert. And then we set a name and a description for what all this is doing. Through the use of these alerts, we can generate some very complex rules and responses to any event that might happen in Azure. So as this said, that's a lot of theory. Dig in now and have a look at some of this in practice.